All right.
Okay.
Okay.
Welcome, Red Wave America, to another discussion video. Today I am here with a guy named James. Is that what you want to be called, or Fletcher?
Yes, thank you, James.
James, okay. We're going to be talking about the Cold War today, so I have questions to ask him. So for the first I'm going to have him introduce himself.
Hello, I'm James. I'm somewhat of a Cold War historian. I've been
Okay.
interested in the Cold War for about maybe a year or two now, and just looking at what happened and seeing its effects on the modern day.
Okay. So for my first question today, could you, in your own words, explain why you think the Cold War began?
Well, we're going to go to the beginning of our story. 1945, Nazi Germany has fallen. There was a talk between the three main Allied powers, which was Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States. They were dividing up Germany and seeing who would be punished with the Nuremberg trials, and Japan was still at war with the United States. The Soviet Union and the United States had found itself in somewhat of this power struggle, really, over who would be the superpower in the world. Today, it is, still kind of the same thing. You see Russia and the United States and now China fighting for dominance in the world. Who is going to be the world superpower? Franklin Roosevelt has died, and Harry Truman, the new president, had went to Stalin asking that there would be free and fair elections in these countries, what would be called, the Eastern Bloc countries. That was divided by, Winston Churchill's The Iron Curtain. And Stalin had agreed there would be free and fair elections within those Eastern countries. Although it didn't really happen like that. Stalin had set up communist parties and that were very well funded and that were put into power by force, more or less, in those countries, such as Poland, such as East Germany, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, all those Eastern Bloc countries. And the USSR has expanded greatly. And the USSR is not just, what we would consider Russia. The USSR contains all of those countries. Like I had said earlier, with Poland, Lithuania, East Germany, and Russia would also be included with that in the USSR. So Stalin has set up his communist parties. He has dominance in the Eastern Bloc, which is what he wants. The more support he has is the better he can, show his dominance as the world superpower.
Right.
But the US has done something that would gain them a lot of popularity. Two plans that happened were the Marshall Plan and the Truman Doctrine. Both of the Marshall Plan and the Truman Doctrine were made as economic support for Europe. And the Marshall Plan was just giving money to those countries who wanted it. Countries who wanted the money could get it. Truman Doctrine was another economic plan to give support for countries, but they could not be communist. And that's when our policy of containment starts to come in. We see that the Soviet Union is trying to get the support of many countries. They're trying to get the support so that they can be the superpower. So we said to ourselves, we have to contain this. We have to contain communism. And you see this kind of a lot in history. You know, in history, you have natural enemies, like between France and Britain. What is the natural enemy there? Catholicism and Protestantism. You have the Native Americans, and you have the U.S. citizens. What is their problem? You have people who want to stay on their land, and you have manifest destiny. And this problem keeps coming up. The Soviet Union sees what they're trying to do with their economic plans and policies of trying to help these countries to get support for the U.S., so the USSR starts up their own economic support plan, which is called Comecon. Not to be confused with, what you'd think as Comic-Con, with, the comic figures and all that. But Comecon was the USSR's economic support plan for countries who would have communism. And it more or less, it's kind of an economic alliance. You know, the European Union, how they have that trade agreement and everything? It's kind of a bit of a similar thing. It was more of an economic alliance, to give economic support to those Eastern countries who needed the help. Because if they didn't do that, those communist countries would start looking towards things like the Marshall Plan and the Truman Doctrine. So it was just to go against the Marshall Plan, pretty much. So that is kind of what started our Cold War off. We have these two superpowers after this huge war that just happens. And they're fighting over dominance in the world. And another thing that happened was the USSR wanted to help take over Japan. Why, you might ask, would the USSR help America? Because if they had helped take over Japan, they would have tried to get an agreement to try and get a part of Japan or some parts in Asia for communist countries. And we'll go back to a bit in that later, because you'll see that happen. The nationalists in China, who was our ally during the war to fight against Japan, becomes communist in a takeover by Mao Zedong, which the communist revolution was starting to happen even before World War II. But they realized that, we're either fighting each other separately against Japan, or we can fight together against Japan, because Japan has taken over a lot of Asia at the time. And so that is kind of what kicks off our Cold War.
Okay. So real quick, what is your opinion on Joseph Stalin?
Joseph Stalin. He comes into power after Vladimir Lenin, and he's not very political, you'd say. He's more extreme on his politics, and a lot of people had thought that Trotsky, a man named Leon Trotsky, would come after Lenin into power, which Lenin, after the Russian Revolution, Lenin, his health is depleting. He's having strokes, he's having a lot of health issues. And people say, hey, there's this man named Leon Trotsky, very political, very smart man. He's going to come into power after Lenin. That isn't what happens. Stalin is there when Lenin dies. Leon Trotsky is halfway across Russia doing something else. So he's the one who's there. And he's the one who says, oh, Lenin wants me into power, not Trotsky. And he basically lies to the Communist Party to try to get power for himself. He sees, this is my moment to take over the Soviet Union. So he kind of more lies to people, manipulates, pays off some people to get into power, and he still sees Leon Trotsky as a threat to his power. So what he does is he exiles Trotsky out of the Soviet Union. And he's very paranoid. Stalin's a very paranoid person. You'll see. He says that's not enough exiling him. I must kill him. He sent a couple of assassins. I think there were 2 assassination attempts. The first one failed, and then the second one, he had killed Trotsky in his house in Mexico City, which shows you the power of Stalin if he can get assassins all the way to Mexico City, which is almost halfway across the world. So Stalin, he's this very bit power hungry, very extreme, very paranoid person, which his whole cabinet, which I'll call it his cabinet, was very afraid of him. And Stalin went to the point of his, power hunger that he would edit photos of himself. You know how you use Canvas or you use Photoshop? Stalin would basically Photoshop pictures of him to make him look popular. Like, there was this picture of him and Lenin. Lenin has more of a frown. It's a serious picture. Lenin, at the time, probably didn't really like Stalin, but Stalin pretty much, used Photoshop and edited it to make it look like Lenin is smiling in the picture, which that kind of shows you the extent of his power hunger. He wants to make sure that his people are 100% loyal to him, that his cabinet is 100% loyal to him. And after Stalin dies, you really see how much people didn't really like Stalin. A man named Georgy Malenkov becomes premier of the Soviet Union, more of an incapable leader. And after Georgy Malenkov, you have this man named Nikolai Bulganin. He's another premier who comes after him. He was once Minister of Defense of the Soviet Union, not a lot to talk on him. Then Nikita Khrushchev becomes premier, which Nikita Khrushchev is already first secretary of the Communist Party, which more or less is leader. But Khrushchev starts his de-Stalinization, which shows how much people didn't really like Stalin. He's removing pictures of Stalin. He's removing statues of Stalin. And really, the Cold War is more reaching its peak. It starts heating up a lot more, especially in Berlin and Germany. Germany is the fighting ground of the Cold War. You have communists, or people who live in communist countries, fleeing across to the western side for better life. I actually talked, when I went to Florida, I had met this Belarusian man. Him and his wife had escaped communism in the 1970s. And I was talking to him, and I said, "Oh, how bad was communism?" He said, "We lived in fear a lot every day. We had stuff censored. We couldn't say these things against the government. And it was just a very bad time." And things like that, like censorship and oppressing the people, don't end with Khrushchev, but a lot lightens up. It's a bit less strict in the Soviet Union than it was with Stalin. Right. So, in my opinion, Stalin is just very power hungry, very paranoid, very bit egotistical, I'd call it. He did think a lot of himself. He thought of himself as this great politician, as this great leader. But
so, do you think America should have, during World War II, sided with him? Do you think that was a great idea?
I think it was better than if we didn't. Because if we didn't go with the Allies, if we stayed in our isolationism again, and not messing with the Allies at all, Nazi Germany would have completely wiped out Britain, and there would have been a lot more bloodshed for the Soviets. The Soviets may have lost. So I really think that it's better that we did team up with Britain and the USSR against Nazi Germany.
Okay. So, also a quick question: who do you think was worse, Hitler or Stalin?
Um, that is very hard to say. And,
Yeah.
you know, Hitler, of course, killed millions of people. And he is this very evil person, you'd say. Stalin was very bad, I'll say as well. He did kill a lot. And Mao Zedong, if you want to go into him real quick, Mao Zedong
Oh,
definitely
yeah.
killed a lot of people, way more than Hitler and Stalin. But I do think that Stalin was better, in my opinion, just because, I don't like all the racial stuff with Hitler. I don't like how he had killed a lot of Christians. He did kill a lot of Christians. He killed a lot of Slavs. He killed a lot of French people, and that was more or less for his ideas of racial superiority. And Heinrich Himmler, who was a very powerful man under Hitler, it was very pagan, very what you'd call in mystical stuff. He believed in paganism greatly. But I'll say, in my opinion, Stalin is better than Hitler. Not by much, though.
Right. Because even I believe Stalin killed
Oh, yeah.
hundreds of thousands of Christians, if not millions.
Oh, yeah. And under Stalin, you have straight state-enforced atheism. But under Hitler,
Yeah.
it's kind of the same way, with Nazis persecuting Christians. And
Did
actually,
they?
Hitler
I
had
thought they persecuted Jews over Christians. Did they also persecute Christians?
the Nazis.
Yeah.
The Nazis, the Nazis didn't persecute them like as much as they persecuted Jews. They killed a lot of Jehovah's Witnesses, if you want to consider them
Oh, I
Christian.
don't consider them Christian. Right.
But Hitler actually had a plan to kidnap the Pope, just to
Wow.
I guess you'd say, blackmail a lot of Christians into supporting Hitler. And the Pope actually signs a deal with Hitler, and we look down on the Catholic Church for that, but you have to look at it from the Pope's perspective. He's trying to appease this man so that he won't kill a lot of Catholics, because Hitler's basically threatening, you sign this or we kill a bunch of Catholics.
Right.
But yes,
Okay.
Christians were persecuted and killed under the Nazis. I think there may have been there were about 1 million Polish Catholics killed under Hitler. There were Orthodox, which of course all of those are Slavs, but still they're Christians. And they had actually, in Dachau, they had built a priest block in Dachau concentration camp, and about give or take 2,000 clergymen, which 95% of them were Catholic. They kept them there. So yes, Christians were persecuted. Heinrich Himmler especially persecuted and killed Christians because he was such a pagan,
Wow. So, throughout the leadership of Russia, there's a lot of leaders during Ronald Reagan's time period. What do you think of Ronald Reagan as the president of the United States during the Cold War?
Ronald Reagan, I think
Yeah.
he did what was best for his country during the war. The Cold War has many different, I'll say, conflicts built into the main conflict of the Cold War. Of course, you've heard of the space race. That's going to the moon,
Right. Yeah.
which we had won. Then there was also the arms race. Who would get more nukes? The
And we lost that.
USSR had won that, and they had spent a lot of money that they couldn't afford to spend. The Soviets had a economic policy they had been using since World War II, and that screwed them over a lot because they're in a wartime economic policy. They're in a war economy, which is not built for peacetime. And even though you may say it wasn't really during peace, that economy could not be sustained in the Cold War. It was failing, and so the Soviets spent a lot of money that they couldn't afford to spend, and the people were living, terribly. Like I said, I'd met that Belarusian man. The people weren't living great at all, and that's why they built the Berlin Wall to keep East Berliners from going over to West Berlin, because in life in West Berlin was way better than in East Berlin. And so, going back to Ronald Reagan a bit, though, we had the money to spend. The United States had the money to spend, and we had kept shoveling money into our defense budget. We kept shoveling it into the Department of Defense. And the Soviets are trying to catch up with us. The Soviets, they don't have the money. They're in this war with Afghanistan, and they're trying to shovel money into their war spending, but they don't have that money at all. And so Ronald Reagan saw this, and that's why, he did put so much money in the Department of Defense. A lot of people said, a lot of liberal people said, oh, Ronald Reagan, he's just this war maniac. He's a war hawk. He wants to go to war with the USSR. Not at all. Really, he saw the Soviet economy declining, and he said, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to shovel the money that we have, which we can afford to lose, to beat the Soviets. Because he said, if the Soviet economy collapses, that means the Soviet Union itself will collapse. That means that people will see communism, they'll see the Soviet Union not as this dominant power. And that was the biggest thing that I like a lot about Reagan. He saw this, and he was a very smart man. Especially for that time, he needed to be president. But in my opinion, Ronald Reagan, yeah, I think he was a great president. I liked what he did during the time of the Cold War. A lot of people did. He was a very popular president.
Yeah. On a scale of 1 to 45, where would you put him? 1 being the greatest.
I'd put Reagan probably I'd put him at about a 1. I'd say he's my favorite president.
He's actually my favorite president, too. I know, though, a lot of Republicans, moderate Republicans or whatever, don't like the guy. They said that he just wasted money away. But reality, Ronald Reagan was one of our greatest presidents that we've had in modern times and probably even in the past. Very, very great man.
Oh, yeah, and he, like I said, he wasn't wasting money. Modern Republicans see he's wasting money, but if you saw it from his perspective, he's seeing the Soviets are going to collapse in a couple years, and if we just keep spending this money we can afford to spend, because we're a rich nation, and the Soviets are at war with Afghanistan, so they're going to lose even more money. Because we had backed the Afghanis in the freedom fighters in Afghanistan, he saw that the Soviet Union was just going to collapse. It was going to be gone. And that would be the end of the Cold War.
Yeah. So, during Ronald Reagan's time period. I think it was his last year or almost last year in the 80s when he did his famous speech, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." What do you think of Mikhail Gorbachev?
Mikhail Gorbachev. He was more of the reformer of the Soviet Union. He was different from a lot of general secretaries before him and premiers. Um, Gorbachev kind of saw the writing on the wall that the USSR is going to fall if we don't do something now. And Gorbachev introduced two policies that made him very popular to his people because the Eastern Bloc citizens are living in poverty. They're living in, basically what you'd call the slums of America during that time, or very just poor people. And he said, okay, I've got to be popular. If the Soviet Union is going to even have a chance at surviving, I've got to get popular, and I've got to change our economy. So he introduced a policy called Glasnost, which Glasnost kind of ended that, what you call oppression, I call it, or like relaxed censorship of what people could say. Like our First Amendment, we have freedom of speech, right?
Right.
He kind of gave the people freedom of speech. If they want to say something bad about the government, let them say it. Or if we're not going to censor as much stuff anymore, and that made him very popular because now the Soviet and Eastern Bloc citizens can say whatever they want, and that made him popular. And he introduced another policy which was called perestroika. You know what perestroika is?
I don't think so.
It was political and economic restructuring of the Soviet Union. He said this wartime economy has got to go. Right? We can't live like this in poverty anymore. We can't live terribly anymore. And he did a lot of economic reform in the Soviet Union, which also made him popular. Citizens are getting better lives. But you know how the saying is, too little, too late. For the USSR, those policies were just too late. The economy was still just terrible. And, I like to hear this saying how Gorbachev shook hands with both Ronalds. He shook hands with Ronald Reagan and he shook hands with Ronald McDonald because he had let kind of Western things come into the Soviet Union, which before were not allowed at all. McDonald's had opened up in the Soviet Union. And after this, if you can, look up a picture of the Soviet Union McDonald's. If you look at it, the lines are packed. It's what you would consider almost like the Chick-fil-A or the In-N-Out Burger of the United States. You always see how those are packed heavily. Just a simple McDonald's in the Soviet Union was packed like that. And
wow.
It was just the brand new thing for Soviet citizens. And slowly, as the USSR was failing, a lot of countries started to break away. The first one was East Germany. After after Berlin citizens were tired of being divided, they tore down the Berlin Wall and reunited Berlin. And East Germany had started the policy, or started to go over to West Germany. There was a plan for them to reunite under a man named Helmut Kohl. It was the leader of West Germany. And he had his whole plan to reunite both countries, and then just one after one, the USSR is breaking down until it's just Russia. And Russia will be the last one to leave. That will end the USSR. And the new Russian leader will no longer be Mikhail Gorbachev. It will be a man named Boris Yeltsin.
Okay. So, with that being said, what do you think ultimately ended the war?
What ultimately ended the war was just the failing Soviet economy and how we could keep up and go past it. How we had more money than they had, and how they had become unpopular just broke down the Soviet Union. And, Mikhail Gorbachev was, like I said, that last little string that kept it together, but, he himself was just done with the Soviet Union, and it finally broke. And when the Soviet Union broke was, the last bit of the Cold War, which a lot of people say the Cold War is still going on today. It just had a break, which you can see that, it's just the name's changed. Instead of the Soviet Union, it's Russia. Instead of Joseph Stalin or Georgy Malenkov, Nikita Khrushchev, or Leonid Brezhnev, it's Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. And I guess if you want to include Kim Jong-un, but, what is little North Korea going to do? It's like a chihuahua.
Yeah.
Thinks it's 10 foot tall, it's really about a foot.
So yeah, so I guess that leads me up to some two bonus questions real quick. What do you think of Vladimir Putin?
Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin is interesting because he was a KGB agent during the Cold War, and he, I think, in my opinion, wants to be back to the glory days of the Soviet Union because he's a bit nationalist, not in the sense of, joining all the races and ethnicities that are his together, but reuniting all the former Soviet countries is his nationalistic goal. And Vladimir, in my opinion, is almost a bit like Nikita Khrushchev or Joseph Stalin. You've got a lot of censorship, and, in Russia, there was this man who had stolen a helicopter and who took it over to the Ukrainians during the war. And after that, Ukraine had given him a bunch of money to move away from the war, and he moved to Spain. About a week or two later, that man is found dead in his apartment. That shows you the power, like I said, of Joseph Stalin. You see the power of Vladimir Putin.
Wow. So during Biden's presidency, I think you and I agree about that guy. When we entered, kind of, into the Ukrainian war, what do you think about the Ukrainian war?
The Ukrainian war, back when it started, and they had conflict even before, the big Ukrainian war we see today. Really, I think it's about kind of what I said. Vladimir Putin is wanting to reunite those communist countries, starting with Ukraine, because Ukraine was a big part of the Soviet Union. You see a lot of Soviet history stuff, like Chernobyl, for example. That was something that was huge to the Soviet Union. It was seen as more of an embarrassment, but Ukraine was important to the Soviet Union, and that's why I think he's starting with Ukraine. And he already has Belarus pretty much in his hands, because what do you see? You see Belarusian soldiers attacking with the Russians against Ukraine.
Yeah, they do whatever they want, yeah.
Yeah. And like I said, the Soviet Union, or sorry, not Soviet, the USSR is not just Russia. It's also Belarus, Lithuania, Ukraine, Poland, Czechoslovakia.
Romania, Moldova, yeah.
All those countries. What do you see here? You see Belarus and Russia. What's going to be next? Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine. What could be after that? Belarus, Russia, Ukraine, and Poland. It's just that is what I think about the Russo-Ukrainian war. I think it's just Vladimir Putin trying to regain Russia to what it was during the Soviet Union.
So do you think, though, ultimately, was it smart for USA to even give money to Ukraine? Because there's things or statements that claim that Ukraine is one of the most evil European countries in Europe. There's very not Christian-like. They ban denominations and everything. So what do you think about their leadership and everything?
I think we should have just not even intervened in Ukraine at all. Just to see what happens if Russia is, successfully taken over Ukraine, which it's more of a stalemate right now. The Ukrainians are really good at defending their country, but when they go on the attack, they start failing. Same with Russia.
Yeah.
Russia is not good at breaking the Ukrainians' defense, but their defense is strong when the Ukrainians are attacking them. The Russians pushing back. And
right.
In my opinion, I think we should have just seen what happened, And Ukraine, I will say they do have some evil leaders, but, I think it's important that we should have watched what happened. Just in case. Because, do we want another Soviet Union? I don't think we do.
No, definitely not. Yeah.
But,
well, I did also have this. Oh, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Do you have any other... I was about to ask, do you have any other questions for me?
Yeah, so someone asked me to ask you about this question. I don't know if this... I'm assuming this is kind of related to the Cold War. The War of Vietnam, which technically, during the Cold War, we were fighting against communism. What do you think about that war? Because a lot of people have opinions on that, whether or not we should have been there or not. What do you think about it?
I think we should have been in Vietnam. Our policy of containment was a very something that was how do I describe it? Our policy of containment was important. We needed to contain communism, and we had another foreign policy called the domino effect. What that was is if a country falls to communism, it's going to spread to another country, then it's going to spread to another country,
right.
Then it's going to spread on and on and on until, every country is against us and whoever else is capitalist at the time. And I think we should have been involved in Vietnam. We were actually winning Vietnam, and we had pulled out. After we pulled out, Vietnam falls. Because the South Vietnamese are a bit incapable to defeating that communism. And, it's...
So whose idea was it to pull out, though? Why did we do that?
Why did we pull out?
Yeah.
Just the unpopularity in America. You saw it a lot in the 60s. Everybody's saying, F you, Lyndon Johnson, you're just a liar to the United States people. We shouldn't be at war. People are dying. And it was just it was just a very unpopular thing. It was very unpopular. And Vietnam is just one of the big proxy wars in the Cold War. A proxy war, is if or not you're fighting directly or indirectly. We fought directly. The Soviet Union sent North Vietnam a bunch of guns and weapons and money, and they sent soldiers. I didn't say anything. But they did send a couple soldiers, even though it's hidden. They're not supposed to be, but they sent a couple. but mostly, their shipment of guns, weapons, money, especially from China as well. China helped Vietnam as well. But, you see so many different proxy wars. Another big one is like Afghanistan. It's the same thing, except the Soviets lose directly. The Soviets get whipped by the Afghanistans. They get whipped by the freedom fighters, and we had sent the freedom fighters and the Afghanis money, weapons, whatever they needed to fight them. And another big one would be the Korean War. People always underrate the Korean War, how important it was, which it's still an ongoing conflict today. We see Kim Jong-un, like I said, he's kind of, you see the Chihuahua Kim Jong-un talking very big, and he still, hates South Vietnam greatly. And he's also another Joseph Stalin, I'll call it. A lot of censorship, a lot of kind of perfection. He wants this perfect society, or that looks perfect, in his opinion. A lot of his people are struggling, and a lot of them are in poverty, while he himself is living off, $1,000 meals.
Right.
But that's my opinion on Vietnam. I think it's better we were there, just to try and contain communism to the best we could. And I actually think it worked out well. If you look at Vietnam, is Vietnam a bad country? It really isn't that bad. Not a lot of crime, and they're not a communist system, I'll say. And they're more of a diet communist, I'll say. They do have some capitalist tendencies, and I say it worked out really well for Vietnam. You don't have a lot of censorship, not a lot of crime. The people aren't in a lot of poverty. They're not like rich, but I think it worked out well for them. And U.S. citizens go there, and they say it's a nice country.
Okay. Well, thank you, James, for your time on the Cold War. I will announce this future project coming up with James. He has agreed to do a series on the Cold War to explain it better, just like Scott is doing on the Civil War. James is going to do one on the Cold War for us. So I want to thank you for that.
I was glad
God bless
to
Red
do
Wave
it.
America. Okay. Yep. Thank you.
All right, thank
God
you.
bless.
God bless.